Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Amanda Augustine and I'm coming to you live from my bedroom to talk some job search stuff. Today I want to particularly focus on resume tips. So I'm hoping you'll join me to hear about some of the mistakes that recruiters consider to be the biggest deal breakers when it comes to writing your resume. I'm also happy to your CV critiqued. You can also have that done for free at topcv.com. So excited to have you all with me. As always, I like to start out by reminding everyone that we have a contest going on right now. It's a resume makeover contest. You can submit your resume to be chosen for a free resume makeover. You can do that at any time by going to topresume.com/resume-makeover. My fantastic colleague and partner in crime, Jenna, will provide the link in the comments below. Again, I'm going to focus on resume tips for the most part today, resume mistakes you should avoid, what components you want to make sure your resume has, but of course I will answer any and all questions that you throw at me that are related to career management, job search, etc. and so forth. I'm really excited to get going. So a few things to keep in mind. There are some hard and fast rules for resume writing, but there are often a lot of it depends when people ask me questions about their resume, because it's really going to depend on your circumstance, your job goals, and what information you have to work with. And I think that's really important to note. So not every resume is going to be the same. It's really going to depend on what information you have to work with and also what are your goals. Because when you're writing a resume, there are a few key things I think you should always keep in mind. Number one, what type of job am I targeting? The technology, the electronic gatekeeper, what does that software care about and what do I need to know? And we did a whole talk about that on the applicant tracking system. And then number three, it's the employer. What does the employer care about? So we've already done a talk specifically about that electronic gatekeeper, the applicant tracking system. Today, I want to focus more on how do you tailor your resume for a specific goal, and then what do employers care about, and more importantly, what's going to really turn them off against your resume. So without further ado, I'd love to get into this. A while back, we surveyed recruiters, hiring managers, HR professionals, and gave them a whole list of various resume faux pas, mistakes you can make, and basically asked them to tell us, well, which ones are a big deal for you? Which ones are truly mistakes that it matters and it could cost you your application, from being in the running? So it was interesting. We had them go through, I don't know, there were a lot of different mistakes we put out there, at least 20, I want to say. And then based on the information they gave us, we determined which are the top 10 deadliest or most costly resume mistakes you can make. When we asked them, could these mistakes cost the candidate the job, the majority, 69%, said yes, these are deal breakers. So that's something to keep in mind. The one thing that I'm really happy to report though, and as we go through all these different mistakes, and I am going to kind of glance to that side because I have them written out to make sure I give them to you in the right order, but with all of these resume mistakes, the overwhelming majority of them can be avoided with a little extra time and care. It's not something that, that's outside of your control. There are a couple that are more challenging, but the majority of them you can avoid very easily by just taking a few extra steps. And so I'm going to start with the number one biggest resume mistake that drives recruiters and employers crazy, and then work my way down. And we'll see, I'll just keep glancing at the time because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for Q&A. But we'll see how far we get. And then I'm also happy to run down the different components of a resume if anybody's really interested in that, to make sure that you're adding all the elements that are typically expected in a resume in today's economy and job market. So starting with number one, spelling and grammatical errors. That was the biggest mistake. And I know this one kind of drives people nuts because they say, well, really a typo? You're gonna kick out my application because of a typo? The truth of the matter is yes, because similar to the technology that reviews your resume through that initial screening process, recruiters, hiring managers, when they get that stack of applications, they're looking for reasons to eliminate applications. They're trying to whittle it down to a manageable number so that they can spend more time looking at the ones that they deem to be a good fit or more interesting and worth more of their time. So the first glance, they're trying to find reasons to get people out of that pile. All the more reason why you want to avoid some of these silly little mistakes, because obviously it doesn't demonstrate anything about your qualifications. What I will say is that when I've talked to recruiters and said, well, why would a typo knock you out of the running? Other than the fact that you're just trying to eliminate people, what does that mean to you? And they normally come back and says, well, they clearly don't care that much if they can't proofread their resume carefully before they submit it. So they think of it as kind of a judgment thing, or a lack of detail, or frankly, a lack of intent for that role. So just things to keep in mind, because obviously that's probably not how you're feeling and not what you're trying to do. In order to avoid typos, grammatical errors, that kind of stuff, there are a few different things you can do for your resume. One, print it out and then proofread it. For whatever reason, the way that we read on a screen is different than the way we read on paper. And so you will actually catch more typos or grammatical errors when you print your resume out after you've already done a review on your laptop or computer. Also, try reading your resume aloud, and try reading it starting at the end of your resume and reading it backwards. When you're looking at things in those different ways, it actually will help. Another tip is try printing it out, but change the font style before you do it. Say your resume is in Arial, put it in Times New Roman or Calibri. Put it in something else and then print it out, because again, that actually will help you not glaze over and miss typos and mistakes. So all right, I think we've talked about that one enough. Number 2, incorrect or missing contact information. I mean, I have actually seen this. I've seen people on social media say, I sent out 100 applications and realized that I never put my email address on my resume. It does happen. Let's just talk about what contact information every resume should possess. Your first and last name. And you want to make it consistent across your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your business cards, whatever you're using for your job search, you want to make sure it's consistent. So if you use your middle initial in one place, then you should use it everywhere. If you're going to put junior or senior or the third after your name, then you should do that everywhere. Just stay consistent. So your full name, your phone number, only one. You do not need to include multiple phone numbers. I would suggest it's your mobile phone number, your cell phone, whichever one is going to be in your pocket and with you so that you can respond to inquiries quickly. And also, you want it to be a number where you're not necessarily sharing it with a lot of other people, so that you also control who picks up that phone when it rings. You can control what the voicemail says, all those sorts of things. I do recommend having a voicemail set up. I know a lot of people don't bother doing that anymore. Set up a voicemail and make sure you state your first and last name in it, or if you're concerned about security purposes, at least say your first name, so that when a recruiter and hiring manager calls, if they get your voicemail, they hear a professional greeting and it's been confirmed that they got the number right. So we go first name and last name or full name, email address, make sure it's a professional email address. We'll talk about that in a second. Your mobile phone number, ideally. Location, you don't necessarily have to put down a location. If you're applying for a job that's local, then you want to put city, state, and zip. If you're applying all over the country or you're looking at remote work, then you don't necessarily have to have a location listed. And you certainly do not have to have your street address on there. It's unnecessary at this stage. If they make you fill an application, sure, add it then, but you post your resume in so many different places, you don't need to give out your full name and your mailing address where who knows who could see it. So keep that in mind. And then more often than not, there's very few exceptions to this rule. You should have the URL to your LinkedIn profile at the top of your resume. And ideally, you customize that URL there's a way to customize the public URL so that it's yet another way to brand yourself and ensure that the recruiter or the hiring manager knows they got the right person. We know they're going to be Googling around and looking for you online. It's much easier if you just provide that information for them. In addition to that contact information, there are extra variables in there. You could have a link to other social media accounts if they're really relevant to the work that you do, such as if you work in social media, then you'll probably have more social media accounts listed. If you're a creative person, you could have a link to your online blog or online portfolio. I've seen people with, their Instagram handle, if their work is very visual, and that's kind of what they use in lieu of a personal website. So those are a couple extra things to keep in mind. But overall, that's the contact information you want to include. I also recommend beyond the first page, on the second page of your resume, at least putting your full name on the top as well, so that if, God forbid, they print out the pages and it's getting tossed around, that they don't lose, that they know when they're looking at your resume who they're dealing with, even if they're on the second page. All right. My name is Amanda Augustine, and today we are talking about resume mistakes, which are the ones that could really cost you the job, and how easy it is to avoid the majority of them and what you can do to ensure that. And then also, if we have time, I'm really happy to go into the different components of a resume. Whatever is most interesting to you all, I'm happy to go into in deeper detail. So we just talked about spelling and grammatical errors is the #1 worst mistake you can make, and some ways to avoid that. Making sure you have all your contact information on there and make sure it's correct. It happens more often than not. Oh, one other thing I want to keep in mind, and we covered this when we were talking about the applicant tracking systems in one of these earlier live chats, but you may have your contact information on your resume, but if you put it in the header portion of the Word document, so if it's in the actual header section, you know how there's a header and footer? If you put your contact information in the header or footer section of a Word document, it actually can get scrambled or become symbols and that sort of thing. It might not get parsed by the system when you apply for a job online. So you do want to include that information at the top of your resume, but don't include it in the actual header section. Make that header section as small as possible and put your contact information just below that. Also, if you include your your contact information as an image. I've seen this before, particularly for creative professionals, where they have a custom font or some really cool thing, and so it's almost their name is turned into a logo of sorts. It's their personal signature, and so they insert that in the top of their document. That actually can't be read by an applicant tracking system either, so that would also come up as your contact information is missing. It happens more frequently than you'd think, so something to keep in mind. All right, moving on to the third most costly resume mistake. Kind of hinted at it before, but it has to do with your email address, and it's making sure that you're not using an unprofessional email address. What am I talking about? Hotbuns1010, keg stand king at blah blah blah. If your email address is something you created when you were younger and you laugh at it but haven't changed it, now's probably the time to change your email address or create a new one that's dedicated to your job search activities. I actually recommend doing this. I recommend always having a second email address that's dedicated just to job search stuff. That way it gets a little bit less spam. It doesn't have as many advertisements coming in. You know that when things come in there, it's something to look at, and it can't get lost as easily. I mean, my work inbox is a very scary place. My colleagues will attest to that. It's a pretty big black deep hole at this point. You don't want your job search email address and all those activities to get stuck into a personal one that might get lost. Also important to keep in mind, I know that I've seen some people do this where they share an email account with their spouse or a family or something like that. You want an email address that's just yours. Just like you should be using your cell phone number as the phone number on your resume, choose an email address that's just yours and that's branded for you. So just get rid of the old ones. Something also that's a tip for those who are battling ageism and age discrimination when they're looking for work. I would avoid, if you have an old Optimum Online email address, or even AOL, Comcast, any of the ones that are kind of the older technologies, or at least that's the association. Go and just get a Gmail account. It's easy, it's free. There are others out there, but I'm just saying avoid the older accounts. It's this automatic perception that you're not keeping up with technology when you're using one of those older email domains, and so it's or an older email provider. So you're better off switching to something like Gmail and branding it just for your job search, so that again you're avoiding any unnecessary stereotypes. All right. Number 4 of the most costly mistakes you can make on your resume. I'm going to read this out loud because it's pretty long. Outdated or irrelevant information. And some of the examples that were given to the respondents of the survey were hobbies, age, marital status. So let's unpack this one, because outdated and irrelevant, there's a lot there. First, let's talk about hobbies, age, marital status. There's a lot of debate over whether you should include your hobbies on your resume. Most people, at least the recruiters I talk to, say it's just filler. It's not what I'm looking for when I look at a resume. I don't need to know that they like Dave Matthews Band and they're really into New York City and things like that if it has no bearing on the job. The only time that I would consider it to be cool or okay to include hobbies is if they're really unique and very telling for your personality. So talking about traveling, cooking, gardening, anything that's kind of a common hobby is not worth putting on there. But if it's a hobby that actually is relevant to the skills that you need to do the job, if it's something where if that's your hobby, it actually demonstrates that you possess a skill set that's really important or valuable in the types of roles you're pursuing, oh my goodness, yes, by all means, put it in there because it's relevant. If it's incredibly unusual and really telling into your personality, if you're into some sort of extreme sport or something like that, then yeah, I think you can also include those because, again, it's an interesting insight into your personality. But if it's just average, I like reading, I like traveling, I like cooking, I'm an avid sports fan, anything like that. I think of like the ones that you'd find on, your average dating profile. If they're not interesting on a dating profile, they should not be included on your resume as well. So things to keep in mind. So that's the hobby situation. In terms of age, marital status, gender, those sorts of things, birth date, that information was actually pretty commonly accepted and required on CVs, the international version of a resume, not so long ago. However, there have been a lot of privacy acts that have been put into place since then, and actually your average CV for most countries, and there are some differences from country to country, but in most cases, actually all that information is not let's try it again. That information is not only not required, but they don't want it because they don't want to be aware of those factors because they don't want to be accused of discrimination in some way, shape, or form. So they want to avoid that. The other thing to keep in mind is they say irrelevant information, and that's a really blanket statement that can include a lot of different things. But what I would say is that whenever you're writing your resume, regardless of what's going on, if your goals are shifting, if you're changing careers, if you're embarking on a new career, anything like that, if it's been a while since you've really redid your resume beyond just like tacking on a new experience, I would always go back over each of your jobs and say, okay, the information that I'm presenting here, is it still relevant and helpful in, making the case for why I'm qualified for the role I'm applying for today? And if it's not, I think about, well, should I replace it, or is it time because the job's far enough in the past that I should probably be minimizing that information? So that's something to keep in mind, since most resumes really focus on the most 10 to 15 years of experience, and they don't really go into very much detail beyond that 15-year window. There are different tools of the trade that you can use in order to kind of hint at some of that information or mention it depending on how important it is. But again, employers typically care about what have you done more recently, not what you've done 20 plus years ago that's relevant to the job I'm filling today. All right, moving on. So we talked about the first 4, and I think those are all ones that are easily avoidable, right? Spelling and grammatical errors, incorrect or missing contact information, an unprofessional email address, irrelevant or outdated information. Pretty sure we just covered that, and those are all things that can be easily avoided with a little extra care and some extra proofreading. Number 5 on this list, though, is one of the ones that I think people struggle with a bit more, and it can be a challenge. So this mistake is failure to demonstrate and quantify results. And yes, this is mistake number 5 on here, but this comes up again and again when we survey recruiters and hiring managers and we do different studies. So a little over a year ago, I think, we did a whole study on the differences between self-written resumes and professionally written resumes. And we were trying to figure out, well, what about professionally written resumes makes them stand out more and tends to attract employers to them more frequently. And of the 3 qualities that we discovered, one of those was this idea about demonstrating your value and quantifying that information wherever possible. And really, it's because you can say you're anything. You can say you're a strong leader, a great salesperson, or you have fantastic communication skills. You can say you have anything, you could possess any skill. But employers are looking for proof to back that up. And it's really about how can you demonstrate that you've achieved things, that you've contributed, that you're not just, you don't just possess a skill, but you know how to use it and provide value as a result of it. So this is something to keep in mind. We actually have a really great article that, Jenna, if you could share it, the one that's on doer versus achiever. So for those of you who've already had a free resume review from us, there's one point we tend to touch on a lot. We're always evaluating everyone's resume and saying, well, are they presenting themselves as a doer or are they presenting themselves as an achiever? And a doer is more of listing your roles and responsibilities. An achiever is packaging that in a way that says, I do these things and this is how I demonstrate that I'm good at them because I've produced results, I've added value. There's an output to what I do at my job. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that I know a lot of people say, well, I don't have an achiever job, so how in the world can I have an achiever resume or something like that? Everyone can write a resume that's framed as an achiever. It's really about how do you prove and demonstrate that you're good at what you do. So even if you're a waiter or a waitress, if you get the best shifts or you're always assigned the busiest shifts, if you've been asked to mentor and train the new hires, or anything like that, that demonstrates that you must be really good at what you do. If it's a summer job and you've been or a seasonal job and you've been asked to come back every season for the last 4 seasons, that demonstrates you must be really good at what you do because they keep wanting you back. All those things demonstrate that you're a solid contributor, and that's really the concept behind this. Now, if you do hold a more, your more average professional job, we're always looking to quantify that information: number of direct reports, budget size of projects, client names and numbers, anything that shows that you are adding value, cutting costs, generating revenue, improving customer ratings, increasing brand awareness, whatever it is. Always look back and think about what are the goals that were set for you by your employer, and did you meet or beat those? That's the information that you want to demonstrate, and that's typically in the bullet points underneath the work experience section. The way that I typically like to write out work experience is put in the company name, the start and end dates of employment, depending on if the companies I've worked for are well known or if they're obscure or just not as widely known, across the country, I may put a one-liner that describes the company, describing all the things that are most important in terms of its size or its industry or something like that. The job title, a short blurb that describes my responsibilities, and then bullet points that are used to brag about my output and demonstrate that I'm an achiever. So I always say that bullet points equal bragging points. What are the most important pieces of information that you want to draw the reader's eye to that demonstrate that you were good at what you did or what you do if you're still there? That's what you want to save the bullet points for. If you didn't stay at a job very long, if you are new to the workforce and so you haven't had a lot of authority or something like that, you may skip the blurb and just go to bullet points and use the bullet points to highlight the most important responsibilities you had that demonstrate what you learned or what skills you built through that experience. Again, it's all going to depend on kind of your stage of your career and what roles you have to work with. So we talked a lot about demonstrating and quantifying results. People like numbers. People make decisions based on numbers, and hiring decisions are one of those decisions they make. So always just try and think of how you can demonstrate the value that you provided your employer and what part you played in whatever that output was. If you don't have numbers, you can either estimate, or if it's something that frankly just doesn't have numbers associated with it, you just want to think in terms of better, faster, more efficient, that sort of thing. Does that make sense? I hope so. There's one other article, Jenna, if you could just share it. It's the other one that's about doer versus achiever, and it's specifically geared, I wrote this specifically for those who had reached out to me and said, but I'm not an achiever, or I'm not targeting a role that would be considered an achiever. So what in the world am I supposed to do with my resume? And I wrote an answer to that on TopResume's blog and gave some samples to help you. I do talk a little bit about like how do you add drama, how can you contextualize your work. I think that's a really useful one for those of you who are kind of struggling with how can you describe the work that you did. Also, if you're starting from scratch and you have to add a position and you've never added it before and you have no idea how to describe your role and responsibilities, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Go on job boards and look for sample job descriptions that accurately describe the role that you previously held, and pull out the lines that echo back what you did, and then tweak them as you need to summarize your work experience. Depending on what role you're going for now, you might look at that job description and say, they're looking to see if I did X, Y, and Z in the past. And then Thomas, and then use proper grammar. I'm on the fly here, buddy. I'm trying to use proper grammar. But thank you so much, and let me know what I didn't properly say. For those of you out there, if the role that you're looking to pursue next is in line with stuff that you've previously done, look at what they're emphasizing in terms of previous experience, and that might actually help you pull out lines that you can then work into the job descriptions for your previous work experience. All right, if you just joined me, my name is Amanda Augustine. I'm a certified professional career coach and resume writer, and I am the resident career expert for TopResume, as well as our sister brands, Top Interview and Top CV. And today we're talking all about resume mistakes that drive employers crazy and what you can do to avoid them. All right, we are on to number 7, annoying buzzwords and/or obvious keyword stuffing. So there's a fine line between incorporating keywords that you're finding in the job descriptions that interest you to help you beat the resume bots, and just stuffing them in there in a way that seems very inorganic and sticks out like a sore thumb. Or, as I've seen some people do, they copy and paste them and put them at the bottom of their resume in white font, hoping they don't get caught. If you can't organically work them into your work experience and your professional summary, then they probably don't belong there, or you need to kind of think about how you can rework them. So that's one thing I'd put out there. In terms of annoying buzzwords, it's all the super marketing, fluffy terms that we think of. I truly think it's hard to avoid adding them at all to the professional summary portion of your resume, which is that, the replacement for an objective statement, and it's more of your elevator pitch. You're gonna have a few of those adjectives in there. I think it really becomes an issue if you have 5 of them in a row or 3 of them in a row. Energetic, organized, problem-solving business leader. If you read it out loud and it sounds corny to you, then it's going to sound corny to a recruiter as well. So keep in mind that you want to tread lightly and use them with moderation, and only use the ones that you can truly back up when you're describing your work experience and education. Because whatever you state you are at top, you need to basically go, echoing back to one of our other mistakes you want to avoid, you want to demonstrate that you actually possess those skills. So you got to back it up with proof, and in order to do that, you have to be able to tie it back to something in your work experience or your education. So something to keep in mind. I am going to go through the next few rather quickly because I want to save time for Q&A, and I see that there's lots of questions already flying in. So something to keep in mind. The next mistake was too generalized or not custom to match the job listing. We talk about this a lot. You really do want to tailor your resume based on the position you're applying for. In fact, that's why when we write your resume, we ask you for a few different job descriptions that accurately describe a job that you would be interested in applying for, because we want to even just create that base document tailored with those roles in mind. But for each position that you apply for, you always want to take a second look at your resume and make minor modifications. You should not be overhauling your resume every time you apply for a job. If you're finding yourself applying to very, very different roles, you either need to have 2 different base documents to work off of, or you need to reevaluate those goals and try and narrow in those search parameters so that you're working off one goal. And obviously in an ideal world, that's what you'd like to do, because you can only have one LinkedIn profile. You can't have multiple ones out there for the same individual. LinkedIn actually has it in their code. They kind of forbid it. So something to keep in mind there. When you're customizing, and I'm so sorry, Jen, I did not include this link for you, but it's the one that has the picture of the 2 cars in the hero image. When you're customizing your resume for a specific job application, you may alter the professional title at the top to speak to the actual name of the job you're applying for. And then sometimes what I do is I will take the job description and put it through a word cloud generator like Wordle. Wordle, and just see what main words are popping up, and then do the same thing with my resume, and or even just look at my resume compared to those results and make sure that if there are terms that are being repeatedly used in the job description that talk about the hard skills or certain pieces of experience or duties and responsibilities, if I have those skills or possess that knowledge, whatever it is, I want to try and make sure that information is highlighted or worded the same way in my resume, so that when either the piece of technology or a human being is looking at my resume, it's very clear to them how I match up to the role. Make sense? Okay, great. Other things. Repetitive words or phrases used in multiple job descriptions. If you have a lot of jobs and they're all very similar, save the most comprehensive description for those roles and responsibilities for the most recent of those jobs, and then try and rework it and include a little less information for the earlier jobs. That's a nice way to kind of avoid the copy paste and making it look identical throughout. Just try and switch up the language, and keep the description shorter for the earlier roles. The most recent one should have the most robust job description. Including a headshot. If you don't work in showbiz or entertainment, anything like that, where a headshot would be included as part of your application, it should not be on your resume unless you're applying to some countries outside of the United States. There are a few countries where it's required. If you go to topresume.com, click on career advice and search, click on any article and then search, say, headshot or photo, you'll get a list of, we have an article on how it varies from country to country and which countries want a headshot and which do not. When I say a headshot for your CV, it would be, a small picture in the upper left-hand corner. If you're in entertainment, it wouldn't be in your resume, it would be an attachment. So something to keep in mind there. Why? Especially, I think we're questioning this more now than we did in the past, because LinkedIn more often than not, you have your photo posted, so isn't it kind of the same thing? They just serve different purposes in the eyes of employers. While LinkedIn is also, used for some applications, and while it is another presentation of your qualifications, it's a more social setting and it's more commonly accepted to see images there. But I will say that some recruiter packages on LinkedIn, they actually have the option to remove the photos and the names from profiles when they're searching for candidates to ensure that they avoid discrimination based on what you look like and what they can tell from your headshot, as well as names so that they can't get any sense of, gender, race, those sorts of things. So something to keep in mind. And the very last one is if your format or design is too elaborate, believe it or not. Nearly 1 in 3 recruiters and employers find that to be a mistake. And we found this as well when we did a different study and we were looking at professional versus DIY. They prefer a cleaner resume, one where it's very easy to identify the pieces of information that they're looking for. They're used to seeing resumes in a certain format. They don't like when you take a detour from kind of the generally accepted designs and formats that resumes come in. I think especially when you get too elaborate with your designs, you put in a bunch of colors, you get a bunch of different creative fonts going on, it just makes it more difficult for them to quickly scan and pull out the pieces of information that matter most to them. And that's why it bothers them. But again, it is number 10 on the list of 10 mistakes. So it is by far the least egregious. So take that with a grain of salt. I would still always recommend sticking to a slicker resume that has a better visual balance of white space and content, so that it's easy to read in a digital format or printed out. Less is more when it comes to a resume's design. Okay, now with all that, I'll quickly go through the mistakes and then I want to get on to those questions. So the top 10 mistakes that employers consider to be deal breakers, starting with the ones that they consider to be the most costly. Spelling and/or grammatical errors. Number 9, incorrect or missing contact information. Number 8, unprofessional email address. Number 7, outdated or irrelevant information such as hobbies, age, marital status, etc. Number 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Failure to demonstrate and quantify results. Annoying buzzwords and/or obvious keyword stuffing. Too generalized or not customized to match the job listing. Repetitive words or phrases used in multiple job descriptions. Including a headshot, and the format and/or design is too elaborate. And those are your top 10 mistakes. So now let's get into these questions. I'm scrolling up. Okay. Please suggest how to cover a work gap in a resume. Excellent question. There are a few different ways you can do this. One, you don't necessarily have to put the month and year when you're doing start and end dates to a job. So sometimes you can avoid making a gap in your resume or an employment gap that obvious if you just eliminate the months and just strictly go with years. So that's a quick fix. Another way to fill that is actually filling them as opposed to just trying to cover them up. Think about what could you be doing in order to fill the gap to show that you are building new skills or learning more or staying in touch with your field. This could be consulting or some sort of freelance work that you're doing. You could even be doing it pro bono. You could be offering your services to friends and family who have businesses that could use your type of expertise, and you could list it as a consulting. You can list things on your resume that you are not receiving a paycheck for. You do not have to be paid for your work in order to put it on your resume, so keep that in mind. There's also, one of my favorite is skills-based volunteer experience. There are sites such as Volunteer Match, Catch a Fire, There's a whole list of them, but those are always the two that I can think of. But if you Google skills-based volunteer opportunities, they're offered all around the world. You can say, I possess this type of skill, and they will match you with different charities or other nonprofit organizations that could really use your expertise but don't necessarily have the funds to pay you. And you could take on those projects, and that's something that you could add to your resume that would then, demonstrate that you are currently employed. If it's a gap in the past, the best you can do is to eliminate the months from the experience. What's done is done, right? But if it's more recent, if we're talking about you're currently unemployed and the time period just keeps getting longer, there are different things you can do that you can put on that you could say you're actively doing now. That will show you as currently employed or at least engaged in something that will help minimize that perception of a large employment gap. It's a great question. And we do have, Jenna, I didn't put this on there, so I apologize, but there is a great question. We do have an article that goes into nitty-gritty detail, some more strategies you can use to fill an employment gap on your resume. And so check in the comments for that. I have 10 years of experience. Do you recommend to include volunteer and references? Great question. No references, regardless of how many years of experience you have, whether you're fresh out of school. References do not belong on your resume. Even a line that says references available upon request, that's also unnecessary. It's actually on the list of things to remove from your resume. Why? Because it's wasting space. The most professionals only get 2 pages of resume space to work with, so don't take up that space with something like that. And 2, employers know you're going to give that information when they need it. They don't need it when they're first reviewing your application. They're going to need it once you start interviewing with them, and so they'll request it when they actually need it. That gives you some time to line those people up. Volunteer experience, 100%. As long as it's active volunteer experience and not something that you did over 10 years ago and you haven't done in over 10 years, I would 100% put it on there. There are some people debate whether they want to put something if it's very politically or religiously aligned if you're not applying for a job in one of those areas. So that's something to consider. Honestly, it's really up to you. But just keep it, think about the employers that you're applying for and what you know about them and their culture. But on average, volunteer experience is always considered, a plus in employers' eyes. Marguerite asks, is it true women over 50 years old, it's harder to find a job in the same field? Is it, I don't know if you're talking about women versus men, but overall, I as much as I'd like to pretend it doesn't exist, the reality is that age discrimination is alive and well in today's job market and has been for quite some time. So yes, it is definitely, it can be more challenging, even if you're staying in the same field, to switch jobs, not even careers, but just switch jobs later in life. It always gets a bit more challenging because there are these misconceptions or perceptions by employers. One, they're afraid that you're going to cost too much money because the more experience you have, the assumption is we will need to pay you more, and so often companies are cheap or say that they just don't have that budget available, so they're concerned. If you ever get the "we think you're too qualified" response, yes, it could just be a blanket age discrimination thing, but it could also be code for "we think you're too expensive, we don't think we can afford you," or "we think this job is too low level for you and you're going to get really bored and you're going to leave us and it's costly to find and hire somebody new." That said, there are things you can do to what I call age-proof your resume that basically try and eliminate some of those flags that employers look for, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously, so that the focus remains on the most important thing, which is your qualifications, as opposed to your age. And so we do have an article on that. If Jenna, you could share that. It goes into, I think, 13 different ways you can, reevaluate your resume to quote unquote age-proof it so that you're less likely to see those same challenges. Also, I will always say, leverage your network I say this every single time we get on one of these, but I think it's really important, especially now in this economy, to invest in your professional and personal network of connections and to really leverage them as part of your job search strategy. It is always okay to ask for help. And I was just asked this morning, how do you approach it if you've been laid off and that sort of thing? Well, you're in good company. There is a large portion of the current population that has been laid off or is unemployed at the moment. And so there are so many people in the same boat that they're, don't even think twice about it at this point. But leverage your network, because if you can find people who work for the company that you're interested in or know people who work for that company, if you can get your application into the hands of somebody who works at that organization and kind of bypass that system, you still tend to have to submit your resume through their system, and you'll still need it to score a high enough, score with the applicant tracking system. But if you can get consideration and kind of avoid that initial electronic gatekeeping or review of your resume, you're much more likely to land the job. You're 10 times more likely to land a job when your application is accompanied by a referral. So anytime you can be referred to an organization by someone who knows them and who really knows you and can advocate for you, you're in a better position. And just keep in mind, that's not just people who mentored you or your peers or your supervisors. That's also people that you've managed throughout your career, because they are now in different spots. They're no longer the junior people, and they also have reach and connections and information that could be very helpful for you in your search. So think above and below as well as to the sides. Those who you reported into, your peers, your vendors, your clients, as well as those that you may have mentored or managed or supervised over the years. Edward, don't include age. Yes, definitely don't include age. Hi, LaQueen. Thanks for joining. Okay, Mosine, what is the standard of resume if the person has no job experience, no internship? Okay. What do you do when you have no experience? That is a challenging one, for sure. If you are fresh out of school and you don't have any experience, I think your best bet, particularly in today's economy, is you need to be looking for internships. And I hate to say it, but because it's so commonplace now to do co-ops and internships while you're in college. When I was in college, and I feel like it wasn't that long ago, but it was a while ago at this point. Definitely well over a decade at this point. But when I was in college, it wasn't even a standard, to get internships. Now, it's pretty commonplace. So if you didn't do any of that kind of stuff when you were in school, you may have to start there. And the good news is there are remote internships, virtual internships. You can search by either of those terms. They are available today in the current climate. I just ran a search last week to double check, and there are plenty available. So that's something to look into. It may not be your dream job, but it will get your foot in the door somewhere. If you've had any type of job at any recently, even if it's not related to your chosen career, I would include that just to show what have you been doing, and really then focus on what did you do in school, what were the projects that you created, anything that's noteworthy and is relevant to the work that you're looking for today. That's what you're going to highlight, because that's what you've got to work with. And that's why I said at the beginning of this talk about resumes is that it's always going to come down to your goals and what information you have to work with. Even as a professional resume writer, I can't invent experience that doesn't exist. I can only work with what I'm given. There's actually a really great article, Jenna, if you could share it, on 11 steps for writing I think the perfect resume or something like that. It's not actually going into how to write the resume. It's all the different pieces of information you should gather in order for you, or for a professional resume writer if you choose to go that route, every piece of information they need to write the best resume possible. Because if you just hand them your current resume, okay, they can reword and change and modify what they have there, but they can't necessarily add extra if it's not, because they don't know about it. So the more information you can provide, the better. So something to keep in mind. Marguerite, yeah, you're an achiever. LaQueen, I love you. I am also an overachiever, and sadly, that is, oh, and now Thomas, I understand your comment. Being an overachiever also makes you scared to death of failure, or at least in my case. Barbara, where do you get the job descriptions? Oh, what a great question. Okay. TopResume has some on their website. So actually, if you go on to, topresume.com, click on career advice, you can go to the search field and search for different terms and it will pull up. Also, you can simply Google a job title and see what results pop up. So for instance, say you're an auditor. You could say, you could either Google sample auditor job descriptions or auditor jobs or auditor job descriptions, job listings, and a bunch will pop up. Google is now kind of aggregating job listings and acting as its own little mini job board by aggregating the data that it sees. You can also go to any job board. There are plenty of large job boards out there, right? We all know the big ones, but I tend to gravitate towards some of the more niche ones that are related to my particular industry or my function. If you're not too sure what that is, I would also professional associations. If you're a part of any professional associations or you've been looking into them, they often have a section dedicated to job listings. That's kind of a very common thing these days. We're partnered with a lot of professional associations that also happen to have a job board. For instance, going back to Marguerite's question before, we're partnered with AARP, and AARP has a really extensive job board that you can check out. And if an employer is posting on there, they know you're over 50 because that's what that board caters to. So that's something to keep in mind. So I would Google for random job descriptions, and that may also point you to a niche job board that's perfect for your job search. So kind of a 2-in-1. Edward, when you add your experience, typically do you add the time range with that company? But this can show your age. Okay, great. I gotcha. Yes, so if one of the jobs you worked at for a very long time, and so your start date was beyond that 15-year window, there's 2 ways you can handle it. One is you say, oh well, I have to include it all. And we do that. Honestly, as resume writers, we sit there and go back and forth and weigh the pros and cons to determine what's the best approach. Because again, while there are some typical rules of thumb, very few of the resume rules are hard and fast, very few, because it really is going to depend on who we're talking to and who we're working with, right? So one way would be to include it because you really need to, because it's an important role and it spans so much time that it's far. 2001 to 2007, or I'm sorry, 2001 to 2008, that's a pretty big span. I'd want to see particularly what role did you hold and how it relates to your career progression and that sort of thing. I'd want to know, are there really some major accomplishments we want to go in there, something like that. But I'd also look at it and say, well, if you were at that company for 7 years, say, and you held multiple roles, because I also, as a resume writer, we always want to know, okay, so tell me how long you worked at the company, but what titles did you hold and what were the time frames for that? We could break it down by those job titles and maybe only show the 2 most recent ones if they fall within the 20 or the 15-year gap or 50-year time. Let's try it one more time. 15-year time frame. And then the others may get a brief mention in a career note or in an earlier experience section. So there are kind of a few different tricks of the trade you can do there and get creative based on what you're working with. Aparna wants to know, can you use color on resume and what would be the ideal color? You can use color on resume. I'm not a huge fan of it. I do it for clients who really want it. And at that point, I stick to one color. It's one accent color. I would do something that is not alarming to the eye. I would not do bright red or anything like that. I typically tend to do shades of blue or green because they're kind of cool and serene and that sort of thing. I have seen some people where they have an accent color and it could be for their headers. You want to make sure it's it's in sharp contrast to the white background. So you want to avoid yellow. You want to avoid anything where it's too close to white and it would be challenging to read. So always think about the readability of your resume. They're glancing at it quickly. I personally tend to stick to shades of blues and greens, but I have seen there's like one that I know some of our resume writers really like that's kind of like an ochre color. In truth, it's not my favorite, but it works because it's sharp enough contrast and it's still kind of a neutral tone. So keep that in mind. For those who are in more creative fields that are like dying to make their resume more creative, more imagery, that sort of thing, I'd say save it for your online portfolio. That's really where you want to show off your talents. The resume tends to be a more cut and dried kind of document, so just keep that in mind. Patrick, any advice on a resume for a professor at a university? Ooh, yes. Okay, so if you are in academia, if you are in science, you actually get to follow a different set of rules because you use what is known as an academic resume or an academic CV. They can be longer because you're going to have information on publications you've been a part of, presentations, that sort of thing. We do have some really great articles on TopResume that are about academic CVs, and I believe one of them has a sample. We even have it as its own page for buying. Like if you decide you want a professional to write your resume, academic CV is its own, as well as federal resume is its own, because they are different beasts of resumes. They just have different rules that go about them. So you don't necessarily need to have a professional title on an academic CV, whereas it is very standard on your average professional resume. You're still going to follow the same rules, but you're going to focus more on, describing what did you write on the side, what did you publish, where did you present, who were you advising students or not, and going more into your subject matter expertise. And so it is going to be a bit of a different resume for sure. But I don't know if you did it already, Jenna, but if you could give the academic CV article on TopResume, we call it academic CV or academic resume. It's there is only one kind of universal standard, I don't want to say format, but standard what needs to go where kind of thing. Yeah, it's standard format. It's international. There is just one universal one, so keep that in mind. And so it does often called both an academic CV and an academic resume. Guys, what is wrong? I only had 1 cup of coffee today and it was half calf, but my tongue is getting tied. All right. Excuse me. Do you recommend to use the same keywords from the job description? Yes, absolutely. That is 100% what you want to do. When you're trying to figure out how to create your base document, I always recommend finding 3 to 5 job descriptions or job listings that describe a role for the type of job you want to do and you feel that you are qualified to perform. And ideally, these 3 to 5 job descriptions are all similar in nature. You're not picking 5 different ways you could go with your career. You're picking 5 that are all describing a similar career path. Ignore location. That doesn't matter because you may or may not want to apply for these jobs for a myriad of reasons. It's really just because the job description, the roles and responsibilities, and the qualifications that they're listing accurately describe what you're looking for and what you feel you're qualified to perform. Then I would take all of those, copy and paste that information into a word cloud generator like Wordle. You can take out the information that describes the company, take out the information that talks about them being an equal opportunity employer with all those kind of terms at the bottom. Just focus on the part that describes the role and describes the responsibilities and the requirements. Copy and paste for all 3 to 5 job descriptions all into the word cloud and see what are the terms that pop up. Those are the ones you want to include in what I call your base document, the original resume that you start with. Then when you go to apply for a job and you find one, you just kind of want to go back over and compare the language in the job description based on what you're seeing on your resume or CV and say, oh, I do have that. I said I have it, but I said it's slightly different. Just tweak the language to mirror what you're seeing on the job description, and that will help you get past that applicant tracking system. Is a picture required on a resume? In most countries, no. There are some countries where it is required, but most are not. There is an article. It's on Top CV. Well, we do have articles on TopResume about headshot in general that will give a list of countries. If you want a deeper detail on CVs from country to country, if you go to topcv.com and you search for the article, how do CVs differ from country to country, you will find this article we even have a chart that we made that describes the differences and shows you which countries do you need the headshot. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is the UAE. I know that they need one. Is it okay for your resume to go to 3 pages? I thought to show all my work. No, you only have to show the most recent 15 years of your experience. The rest of it should actually be truncated in either a career note, which is a little blurb, or a subsection that's called earlier career work that simply lists company names, locations, and your title for each of those. And you, again, something to keep in mind, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I want to make sure this is clear. Always think of your resume as a marketing document. You get to curate the information that you include. You get to decide what information you want to highlight, what information you want to downplay, and what information you want to omit entirely. You don't want to create employment gaps, but you can decide what you want to put in that resume and what you don't necessarily want to touch upon. It's not a transcript of your work experience and your education where you have to list every detail. If you have to fill out a job application and they tell you to list every job you ever performed, then yes, you must fill that out in detail. But for your resume, you get to decide what you show. It's a marketing document, and you want to present the best version of your career story based on what happened in your career and what's the goal that you're pursuing today. So keep that in mind. You can go to 3 pages, but it's not advised unless you're doing an academic CV. Unless you're doing a federal resume, your resume should really be 1 to 2 pages. In fact, there was a study done that showed that recruiters prefer a 2-page resume 2.3 times more so than a 1-page resume. They don't necessarily want to go to 3 unless there's really a need to do so. We do have an article, Jenna, if you have time to pop it in the comments, on how long should my resume be. This talks about all the different lengths, kind of the caveats or the exceptions to the rule. And then if you are trying to summarize a lengthy career into 2 neat pages, I give you some tips and tricks as to how you can go about that. Okay. So Marguerite says, I'm a truck driver over the road for 20 years. I'm trying to get into the office to work the same field, but no experience in dispatching or logistics. If you're currently working, Marguerite, definitely start making friends with those dispatchers and those or those in logistics or both, and just get a sense of what differs. Also think about how much communication you have with them. Do you have the opportunity to kind of lend a hand in some way, shape, or form, or just get them on the phone and do a little bit more of kind of an informational interview where you can get a sense of what are the skills that are most important to what they do, and are there ways that you can find outside your day-to-day job where you demonstrate those skill sets. That's going to be your best, because I'm thinking it's communication, it's logistics, it's discipline, it's organization, those sorts of things. If there are other aspects of your life, whether it's volunteering, whether it's working at your local church or in your kids' school or whatever it may be, where you can demonstrate that you've been leveraging those skills in other areas of your life, you can work that into your resume. Also, because you've been part of this for so long, I would leverage the heck out of your existing connections, people that you formed relationships with over time, those who know that you're great at what you do and that you would be good at taking on this type of role, and try to leverage them to, again, refer you for different positions that are open in more of logistics or dispatching. I think that's I think that's a great bridge for you. I love that that's what you were looking for to move into more of an office role, because that's a perfect bridge. You have so much experience working with the target customer, drivers, right? So yeah, that's a great way, and that's an easier career change resume to write because of that bridge. I am running out of time. We're going to take a couple more Okay, so for someone who just graduated, how do I set my resume to look like a professional? We have a page on our site that kind of gives you a section of our blog. If you go to topresume.com/category/resume-samples, you can get a list of every article where we have included a resume sample, and there's one specifically dedicated to those who are fresh out of school. That will show you exactly what you need to do. Yogesh asked about which resume is ATS compatible, visual or simple text. So you want to go with, you don't have to go simple text. It doesn't have to be a plain text document. A Word document is your best bet unless the application or the system specifically states that it will accept PDFs. PDF keeps your design and your format and everything intact the best, but not every applicant tracking system can actually read and parse the data that's contained within a PDF. So I would stick to a Word document. Okay, so I'm getting something about I am a procurement professional. So in general, how do I figure out what keywords to go in my resume? We already talked about this. Go back to the job descriptions of the roles that you're interested in, and what are the words that are routinely popping up in those job descriptions. If you possess those skills, if you have that knowledge, if those words relate to you and your experience and your qualities, you want to incorporate those words into your resume. That's the easiest way to identify the keywords that you should be using in your resume, because it is always going to depend on the particular position you're looking at. Nick says, I listened to a famous career counselor video. She said that if you have less than 500 contacts on LinkedIn, companies will not give you a second look. Is that true? I have never heard that. I think she just wants you to have a lot of connections. I will say that the power behind LinkedIn does have to do with the size of your network. So the larger your network, the better off you are. I really use LinkedIn as a research tool and an initial communication tool in many ways. It is, of course, a personal branding tool as well. It gives employers more of a 360-degree view of you as a professional. It allows you to include things such as insights into your personality that are a little bit more challenging to do in, say, a resume. However, and the strength comes because one of the things I always say, whether you're looking for a career change or you're looking for an in at a company that interests you, or you're interested in exploring some new field, always run an advanced search on your LinkedIn profile to identify people who are working in the industries or companies that interest you. And you want to look for, first and second connections. And second connections means you're not connected, but you have a mutual connection, a mutual acquaintance, so to speak. You'll have more of those if you have more first connections. So obviously, the bigger your network is, the better it is for you. I think it's silly. I don't know where she would have come up with that stat. I'm pretty sure I couldn't even venture a guess as to where she came up with that. I think she was just trying to impress upon you that they want to show a presence. They want to show that you don't have 10 connections, that you're actively using it. So take her comment with a grain of salt, but do consider investing in growing your network. And I don't just mean randomly hitting up people to connect with, but finding people that make sense given what you're looking for and where you want to go in your career, and connect to anybody you know that you haven't connected to. Think about friends, family, fellow alum from your university. Think beyond just who you worked with directly, and that will help. Graphics used in a resume. I'm anti-graphics on a resume in general, because they can't be read by an applicant tracking system. And a lot of times from the ones I've seen where it's like, these are my skills and I put how many dots I think is my expertise. It's all subjective. It doesn't necessarily tell the reader anything. And so I'd be careful with graphics. I'm not a proponent of them. I think it just draws attention away from what they really need to look at, which is your qualifications. How many bullet points? Okay, so that's really interesting. You typically are always trying to get at least 2 bullet points, but in some cases you may have to just put 1. I don't like to go over 7 bullet points. I really try and, with job descriptions in particular, have a blurb that's a paragraph that describes my role and responsibilities, and then go anywhere from 3 to 5 bullet points that are pulling out important accomplishments and things. But it's truly going to depend on how long you worked at that organization and how relevant it is to what you're looking to do next, and what do you have to talk about there. Unfortunately, I am out of time. I'm about 10 minutes over at this point. There's a bunch more here. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna try and take some of these questions, and I do have to hop into a few more meetings, but between now and the end of the week, I'm gonna come back and try and tag you in this thread and respond to your question with a short blurb. But also I'm going to ask if my colleague Jenna could help me by taking some of these, and we'll put them to the side. And so next Tuesday I can come back. I think we're just gonna keep talking about resumes. I think this week we really spoke about the mistakes. Next week, I'm gonna go line by line the different sections of a resume, and then what are some of the extras you can consider putting into your resume, and then we'll continue answering some of these questions. So thank you all so much for tuning in with me. My name's Amanda Augustine, and I'm the resident career expert for TopResume and its sister sites, Top Interview and Top CV. Thanks so much for tuning in to listen to my resume tips today and ask your questions. And join me next Tuesday if you still have some questions you'd love to have answered. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.